Hallo liebe Deutschlernerinnen und Deutschlerner, ich hoffe es geht dir sehr gut. Wir nehmen zwei einfache Sätze, two very simple sentences mit zwei Informationen. Hans wohnt in Berlin, Hans lives in Berlin und er ist 30 Jahre alt. He is 30 years old. Wohnt in Berlin ist Information Nummer 1 und er ist 30 Jahre alt ist Information Nummer 2. So we can, very simple, just put them after each other and then we have two correct perfect sentences. This is great for A1, but for A2, B1 or especially even higher, there is a much nicer way to do this. By combining those sentences. Zum Beispiel, Hans, der in Berlin wohnt, ist 30 Jahre alt. Hans, who lives in Berlin, is 30 years old. Or you can also say, Hans, der 30 Jahre alt ist, wohnt in Berlin. Hans, who is 30 years old, lives in Berlin. Both sentences here are absolutely perfect and correct. It all comes down what you think is more important. And it's very simple. If you think the information with 30 Jahre here is more important, then you use the first sentence. Hans, der in Berlin wohnt, ist 30 Jahre alt. Because the information in the main clause, which is Hans ist 30 Jahre alt, is the more important information. And the information in the relative clause, der in Berlin wohnt, is kind of the second information, less important than the one in the main clause. So if you think that he lives in Berlin is for you the perfect information or the most important information, then you would pick sentence number 2. Hans, der 30 Jahre alt ist, wohnt in Berlin. This topic is called Embedded Relative Clauses, a B1 topic, und auf Deutsch heißt das eingeschobene Relativsätze. Now, before we go into detail to these embedded relative clauses, I would like to give you a very short summary about Relativsätze, relative clauses. A relative clause helps you to add extra information without starting a new sentence. And this is this whole thing about relative clauses because you can combine sentences, you can combine information, you can add information in one sentence, which does not only sound more natural, but also improves your level of German. Let's take the sentence we had before. Hans, der in Berlin wohnt, ist 30 Jahre alt. This der in this relative sentence is das Relativpronomen. And this always refers back to the noun mentioned before, which is Hans here. So the relative pronoun refers back to the noun before. Important, the relative pronoun has to match the person and the gender of the noun it describes more in detail. So here we have Hans, which is masculine, it's a dude, plus singular. Therefore, the relative pronoun also has to match it, has to be masculine and singular. When it comes to cases, there is something special because when it comes to cases, the relative sentence stands on its own. You have to look just at the relative sentence. The main clause, which is here, this Hans ist 30 Jahre alt, will not give you any information about the case you have to use for the relative pronoun. This is important. So you only see the case inside the relative clause. Here, Hans, der in Berlin wohnt. This der is in red, meaning nominative, meaning it's the subject of this relative clause. Why is it the subject? Because there is no other noun or something which could be the subject. We have also in Berlin, which is an additional information, preposition plus noun. This never can be the subject. And it also matches the verb conjugation. Der, third person singular, wohnt, also third person singular. So here, relative pronoun is the subject, therefore nominative case. Second sentence, Hans, den ich oft besuche, ist 30 Jahre alt. The main clause information is still the same. Hans ist 30 Jahre alt. But now in the relative sentence, we do have this ich. And whenever you see ich, you know ich is always the subject. You also see this, you can kind of double check when you look at the verb, because the verb conjugation is ich besuche, this I, which is for the first person singular. So here the subject is already gone. Now we have to look at the verb. Verb is besuchen, and like the vast majority of all German verbs, besuchen takes the accusative case. Therefore, relative pronoun here is in Akkusativ, den ich oft besuche. Hans, dem Berlin gefällt, ist 30 Jahre alt. Here, again, we'll only look at the relative clause, dem Berlin gefällt. Gefallen is a dative verb and is one of those special verbs which do actually change the subject and the object. So the person becomes the object and the thing, here the city Berlin, becomes the subject. So Berlin is the Subjekt and the person, dem is in Dativ, is the object in dative case because gefallen is ein Dativverb. And another dative Satz, Hans, mit dem ich oft telefoniere, ist 30 Jahre alt. Here we have a preposition, mit. And mit always takes a dative case. That's why here the relative pronoun dem is also in dative case. And here as well you see this ich. So you have the subject already, ich telefoniere mit dem. Of course, you start with the preposition in a relative clause with a preposition, mit dem ich oft telefoniere. And another very important information about relative clauses is all relative clauses are Nebensätze. Relative clauses, Relativsätze sind Nebensätze. Relative clauses are subordinate clauses, which means, you know it, in a relative clause, the conjugated verb stands on the last position. Let me give you another reason why embedded relative clause, now it comes to embedded relative clauses, are very important and useful. Let's have a look at those two sentences here. Hans spricht mit Toni. Hans talks to Toni. Wohnt in Berlin. He lives in Berlin. So we have Hans and we have Toni, two different men. And then we have this in the second sentence, this It's just he. But who is this referring to? Is it to Toni, referring to Toni, or is it to Hans? We actually don't know when we just look at those two sentences without context. And that's where embedded relative clauses come in very handy. Hans, der in Berlin wohnt, spricht mit Toni. Hans, who lives in Berlin, speaks to Toni, speaks with Toni. And now we know 100% for sure it's Hans who lives in Berlin. So this before is here referring to Hans. Or Hans spricht mit Toni, der in Berlin wohnt. Hans spricht mit Toni, der in Berlin wohnt. Hans speaks with Toni, Hans speaks to Toni, who lives in Berlin. And now here we live, this wohnt in Berlin is referring to Toni, because it comes right after Toni. Therefore, we know now who lives in Berlin. This is not an embedded relative clause, this is just a normal relative clause, but you see that in general a relative clause can give you information, additional information, and also give you clarity about the context. The relative clause directly follows the noun, it gives more information about. This is what we had before. Machen wir ein paar Beispiele für embedded relative clauses. Marias Hund ist zu dick. Maria's dog is too fat. Hat immer Hunger. He is always hungry. Zwei Sätze. Now we want to combine them using a embedded relative clause. Marias Hund, der immer Hunger hat, ist zu dick. Marias Hund, der immer Hunger hat, ist zu dick. Here we have Marias Hund, which is the subject of the main clause. Marias Hund ist zu dick, that's the main clause. And in the subordinate clause or in the relative clause, in the embedded relative clause, we have this der immer Hunger hat. Der here is also the subject in nominative case. Another example. Ich habe ein Buch gelesen. Es war sehr spannend. I have read a book. It was very exciting. Now, let's combine those two sentences. Ich habe ein Buch gelesen, das sehr spannend war. I have read a book that was very exciting. This is kind of the normal relative clause, which is absolutely fine as well, but you could also use an embedded relative clause by saying, das Buch, das ich gelesen habe, war sehr spannend. This one is even a little bit nicer or better because we have this spannend. The most important information here is right at the end of the main clause, which makes it more understandable for the reader or the listener. Here, in terms of cases, das Buch war sehr spannend. Das Buch is the subject of the main clause. And for the relative sentence, das ich gelesen habe, again, ich is the subject, nominative case. Lesen, etwas lesen, lesen plus Akkusativ, therefore, das is in accusative case. Even though you can't actually see it, nominative and accusative is for neuter nouns. Das Buch, is it the same? Next example. Du triffst heute Lars. Ist mein Kollege. Du triffst heute Lars. You will meet Lars today. He is my co-worker. Becomes Lars, den du heute triffst, ist mein Kollege. Lars, who you're going to meet today, is my co-worker. Here we have Lars ist mein Kollege. Lars, the subject of the main clause. Den du, again, when you see du, same like ich, you know this is the subject, the nominative case. Du triffst. You can also again double check it with the verb. Therefore, treffen, jemanden treffen, to meet someone. This is the direct object in accusative case. Therefore, the relative pronoun is in Akkusativ den. Und Maria hat Durst. Ich bringe ihr eine Cola. Maria hat Durst. Ich bringe ihr eine Cola. Maria is thirsty. I bring her a Coke. Could be, Maria, der ich eine Cola bringe, hat Durst. Maria, der ich eine Cola bringe, hat Durst. Oder Maria, die Durst hat, bringe ich eine Cola. Maria, die Durst hat, bringe ich eine Cola. Both perfect sentences, both is possible. Again, it's more, if you want to say, or if the information with Maria is thirsty is more important for you, then you would use the first sentence. If you think I bring her a Coke is the information which is more important, then you would use the second sentence. But important here in terms of cases. For the first sentence, Maria hat Durst. Maria is the subject. She is thirsty. The main clause is Maria, the subject. Der ich eine Cola bringe. Now, bringe is one of those verbs which can have two objects. And of course a subject, which is again here this ich. And the other two objects, one is in dative case, one is in accusative case. The person is in dative case. And the thing, here, Cola, is in accusative. That's why the relative pronoun is der. Der is the relative pronoun dative case, feminine singular, because Maria ist eine Frau. Now for the second sentence, Maria, die Durst hat, bringe ich eine Cola. Maria, who is thirsty. So first for the relative clause, we have this die, there is no other thing than just Durst, this is just the object. So die is the subject of the sentence in nominative case. And for the main clause, bringe ich. You see this ich there, that's the subject, therefore Maria actually becomes the object in dative. I would say more commonly, definitely, is the first sentence is also easier to understand because you have usually the subject on the first position in the main clause. Maria hat Durst is the main clause. And then der ich eine Cola bringe. Next one. Die Frau, mit der ich im Kino war, ist nur eine Freundin. Die Frau, mit der ich im Kino war, ist nur eine Freundin. The woman I was with at the cinema or at the movie theater is just a friend. Useful sentence might be for some of you out there. Here a small side note. In German, this is a common question I get from students, is that this eine Freundin, what is this actually? Is this a girlfriend or is it just a friend or so? It is always like this. If we use the possessive article, meine Freundin, and it's clear it's my girlfriend. And we talk about girlfriend. When we use an indefinite article, like in this case here, eine Freundin, this just means it's a female friend, not girlfriend. Of course, you can think what you want about this sentence, but what is going to happen here or not. But anyway, this is just as a small side note. Eine Freundin, indefinite article, is a friend. It's a female friend, not girlfriend. Meine Freundin would be my girlfriend. Der Tisch, auf dem das Buch liegt, ist aus Holz. Der Tisch, auf dem das Buch liegt, ist aus Holz. A table on which the book lies is made of wood. Und das Haus, in dem wir wohnen, ist sehr alt. Das Haus, in dem wir wohnen, ist sehr alt. The house we live in is very old. When we look at all these three relative clauses here, we always have a preposition. So when we look at the cases, mit always takes the dative case, nothing to worry about. Die Frau mit der, for the first sentence, die Frau is feminine singular, that's why mit der relative pronoun in dative feminine singular. Second example, auf dem das Buch liegt. Das Buch is a subject. Auf ist eine Wechselpräposition, a two-way preposition, here used in dative case. That's why auf dem, der Tisch, maskulin auf dem. Und das Haus, Neutrum, in dem wir wohnen, in is also a Wechselpräposition, used here in dative case. So, these Wechselpräpositionen, they are here used in dative case. But of course, you can also use them in accusative. Like for example in this sentence. Das Haus, in das wir ziehen, ist sehr alt. Das Haus, in das wir ziehen, ist sehr alt. Here we have in, eine Wechselpräposition used in accusative. Why? Because ziehen, this verb ziehen, is a movement from A to B. Which brings me to the Bonustipp. Wechselpräpositionen. There are 9 Wechselpräpositionen. Just these 9 here, nothing more, nothing less. Those 9 Wechselpräpositionen, they can either take accusative or the dative case. Let's take the same examples we just had before. Das Haus, in dem wir wohnen, ist sehr alt und das Haus, in das wir ziehen, ist sehr alt. Important are the verb inside this relative clause, or inside the clause we use the Wechselpräposition in here. Because this verb will tell you which case you have to use for most situations. It's either a verb which doesn't involve a movement, like wohnen. So you're not going from A to B, you're stative, you're not moving. Therefore, you have to use dative. And you answer the question, wo? Wo wohnen wir in dem Haus? Now, ziehen is a moving verb. You move from apartment A to apartment B. So it's a verb of movement. Therefore, you have to use accusative. And here for the question for wo, for accusative, this would be this wohin. Wohin zieht ihr? Where are you guys moving to? Wir ziehen in das Haus. Now, in terms of verbs with a movement, there's not too many. And I really suggest you memorize those 8 verbs here because those are the most commonly used ones when it comes to, like for example, Wechselpräpositionen. So you can know whenever you have these verbs with a Wechselpräposition, you most probably have to use them in accusative. There are exceptions when you can use them also in dative case, but those are very rare. If you want to go into detail with Wechselpräpositionen, just click on this video here. If you want to know about the top 20 most important Verben mit Präpositionen, then this video here might be for you. I hope you learned something. I hope it helped. I hope you liked it. I hope to see you again. Bis zum nächsten Mal. Tschüss und bye bye.